Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. And we will jump into our next session about NAFTA and, well, now the USMCA, or TEMEC, as they call it in Mexico. I want to do a brief introduction for Dr. Jesus Seade. Dr. Jesus Seade is the Undersecretary for North America in Mexican President Andrés Manuel López Obrador's new administration in the Foreign Ministry. Seade served as then President-elect López Obrador's chief NAFTA negotiator, where he spent many weeks at the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative here in Washington. Prior to that, Seade served as vice president of two leading universities in Hong Kong and China and served on the advisory board of the Ministers of Trade plus Financial Services in Hong Kong. He's a former ambassador to the General Agreement of Tariffs and Trade and served as Deputy Director General of the World Trade Organization. He's also served various roles at the IMF, World Bank. He received his bachelor's degree at UNAM in Mexico and his PhD from Oxford. Thank you so much for being here. You've had a very busy year. So let's jump into talking about USMCA. You got a first row seat at the negotiating table this year with President Trump's administration. You've mentioned before your longtime relationship with U.S. Trade Representative Robert Lighthizer. What's it like being in the room where it happens? And I mean, what are some key takeaways from the process of getting to this deal and the agreement that we got?
Well, first of all, thank you very much, Sabrina, for hosting me personally, and to the Atlantic Council. It's wonderful to be in this meeting. I've been in some meetings of the Atlantic Council, but this one is really non-regional. It's a core event, so it's an honor and a pleasure. Well, this negotiation, couldn't be more important, certainly for Mexico, and I believe fairly important also for the United States, at least judging from the intensity that President Trump put into it from the beginning. I really believe it's a very significant development for the region, for the continent, and I would like to explain why. In the terms that you put it, being in that negotiation in the meeting room, it was very exciting because it was a negotiation that had been going on for a year or 11 months when I joined. Well, 11 months since it started, but it had been dormant, suspended for 4 or 5 months because the elections were looming, and so they were not getting anywhere. And so when I joined, it was a very exciting time of great uncertainty. Are we going to be able to make it? We had scarcely 2 months to complete it if we wanted it to be signed by the previous president of Mexico, Peña Nieto, which was the assumption everybody wanted, without which you would really have to reopen everything that had been negotiated in a bigger way. So it was a tense time of challenge against the calendar, with pretty much all the major issues not having been as much as touched. You can count at least 10 major issues that were kept for the end. And so it was a wonderful exercise. And let me just add that, of course, López Obrador came into power because he challenged the status quo, the politics in Mexico, primarily along 2 axes that I found very attractive, which is what drew me to him, which was his emphasis, attention to income inequality that has become very extreme, more than in other countries. And secondly, his priority on corruption and law and order, crime, all that spectrum. So it's a very attractive kind of set of propositions with great contrast. Very even animosity during the election time with the present regime, with the previous regime, with the then present regime, and so it gives me really great sense of satisfaction and pleasure to have been part to an exercise of recognizing that trade is alien to all those issues. So we found a way to work together with the previous administration on social issues, on corruption, on many things. The divorce could not be bigger. The cleavage could not be deeper. And nevertheless, we worked as one. as one. It was a really wonderful exercise of, in American terms, non-partisanship. So this led to a very satisfactory result for Mexico, but I believe also for the United States.
And I mean, looking at it from López Obrador's perspective, we've talked before about how he didn't want to have to handle this at the beginning of his administration. He would prefer to have it wrapped up under Peña Nieto. What are your thoughts on the deal that you were able to arrive at with that time frame, and what is, I mean, the administration's view?
As I said, I think it's a great result for Mexico. I think it's a great result for the United States. But it's also not just good against bad. It's also a sea change in the way things are being done. So I think, let me just briefly put to you two features of this deal that I think make it very novel, very kind of a change of direction in relations between the US and Mexico, but also in trade treaties globally. And I really expect it'll have consequence beyond the treaty actually negotiated between us, as setting the pace, setting the tone for future trade agreements. The first one is that, well, of course, it was born out of clear hostility from President Trump towards the deficit with Mexico and trade and all those companies that have gone across the border to set up shop there and export cars to the United States instead of producing the cars and giving the employment in the United States. So it was basically an undertone of hostility to this kind of trade. But the result of that, the consequence of that, is that certain things are done in the treaty agreement. We call it treaty in Mexico, it's a treaty for us. Certain things are done that appear to be hostile to trade. It's more difficult, for example, to import parts. Import means trade. Import parts from Germany or France or Korea or Japan to complete the vehicles, if we're talking of the car industry, which is the most important part of the economic commercial relationship. It makes it more difficult to import those parts to complete the car and export it duty-free to the United States. So it sounds like you are against trade. But in fact, nobody is raising trade tariffs. The United States is not raising trade tariffs. Mexico is not raising trade tariffs. So it's not really protectionism against trade. What this really means is that we collectively are creating a strong incentive for those Koreans and Germans and French and Japanese to invest in North America. Because you cannot import the part, you have to have a much higher percentage of the cost of the car incurred in North America. So you cannot import, you have to invest. And by doing that, the relationship in the two countries, well, three, it's actually also Canada, but I'm thinking very much of the bilateral. The relationship between us changes qualitatively because there is less room for trade with the outside world. A free trade agreement, okay, gives you good business opportunities, but it doesn't really give you that much of integration of the economies. You're just trading. You're putting things in a box and send it off. Now there has to be much higher level of investment linking the countries in the region. Investment from North America or from Mexico or from Korea or Germany. Investment in the region. And investment linkages are much deeper. They really move us in the direction of a deeper form of interaction. So that's really the main message that I want to posit to you. That this, unwittingly, there was not intention to think in those terms, but this is increasing the amount of investment that has to be done in the region by Germans, Koreans, or Americans or Mexicans, investment in the region to be able to function within the terms of the new treaty. And that begins to create a deeper form of economic union in the region. Now, I was listening with great interest to the previous session, with great apologies because I was unable to come to earlier sessions, but I understand from what they said that much of the discussion was along similar lines. All this discussion about where is the world heading, and how is the United States going to respond to challenges coming from a changing world order in the economic sphere, and beyond the economic sphere. And I really would say that one element that is changing out there in the rest of the world, is that the world is behaving, at least in economic terms, and probably also in other terms, more in terms of blocks. The European Union is more united than it was 30 years ago, despite Brexit. But it's more united as an economic unit, as an industrial behemoth. China is very quietly integrating a lot with the neighboring countries. It's not the same China as 10 years ago. 10 years ago, China was producing everything from the more advanced they had to cheap. It was the cheap factory of the world. Now the cheap factory of the world is in Vietnam, in Bangladesh, in other countries. They are increasingly integrating the value chain with the region. So there is more and more of an Asia, East Asia, that we are dealing with, that the United States is dealing with. China may be the politics, and China may be the big challenge, the opposite number. But in fact, the economy is increasingly regional. Well, again, without much design about it, the North American region now becomes more of a region, because investment is increasingly the name of the game, rather than trade. And the second thing, just quickly, is that responding to the 1% in Manhattan and to all the social challenges that we have around the world, this treaty is the first one to really go deep in the direction of including what I call social issues or responses to social concerns. It has an anti-corruption chapter, labor practices chapter, environment where ozone layer issues are given great prominence, but climate change is not mentioned, but still it's a very good chapter on environment. It has a chapter on supporting small and medium enterprises, again, a very social concern. Even culture makes its appearance all over the place. So it's an interesting treaty that I think moves in the direction of greater integration of the economies through investment, and at the same time recognizing that goes into social issues in a way that was not part of trade treaties before.
Okay. And I mean, now the next part of this is, it's been signed. Peña Nieto, before his last day in office, signed it, and the other two leaders did as well. But now it's up to Congress. Now it needs to be ratified in the 3 countries. And in the US, Congress has already raised concerns. House Democrats in particular are talking about labor provisions and that they're not strong enough. And that was a big focus in the negotiations, of making sure that it would be an area that they could please Democrats. What do you have to say to lawmakers that are having these comments about labor provisions, them not being strong enough as enforceable?
Well, labor provisions are extremely strong. The labor chapter and an annex on labor union, the chapter is protection of labor policies, and the annex is on trade unions formation. Is almost a blueprint of best practice on labor issues, if you were to give it to the International Labor Organization and ask them to draft it for you. What it is missing in the viewpoint of many Democratic congressmen is enforcement. And enforcement is a trade issue, it's not a labor issue. It's enforcement that is the issue. Now, I really have to remind you of, remind the audience, of the original NAFTA. The original NAFTA was negotiated under the presidency of the late President George Bush Sr. And as a coincidence, I mean, just as now, right when it was completed, there was a general election in the United States, and President Clinton came into power. So again, from Republican to Democrat. But that one was far more of a tsunami change in politics. It was Clinton with the immense power that the Democrats brought into the scene then, and they came with tremendous demands for inclusion of labor and environment issues. But the assessment was, the response was, well, come on, we have negotiated this is closed. If we open that, there'll be umpteen issues that will be opened, whether I want it or not, but pressures will come from all over the place, in the United States, in Mexico, in Canada. So there was resistance to reopening, and not a single comma was changed in the treaty itself, in the agreement, the NAFTA. Not a single comma was changed, despite the strength of the Clinton onslaught. Instead, what was done was to find a creative solution, a creative address to the issues by having two separate agreements that serve the very useful purpose of advancing the labor and environment agenda in the intervening period. This time around, again, I think it'll be very disruptive because there are many issues that are kind of hanging from pins on the wall that could be reopened by any of the three countries. And but I'm pretty sure that the concerns being raised by these hugely respected democratic lawmakers can be addressed in other ways by making more effective, more immediate, for example, the resort to dispute settlement solutions for labor disputes, because the labor provisions are good. The issue is, will Mexico enforce them? It's a question of enforcement. Well, the way to enforce issues is through dispute settlement, and we can cooperate in strengthening the dispute settlement system, for example, by having judges to be used in those processes, appointed upfront, and having greater confidence that it's going to happen.
So Mexico is willing to have these discussions and potentially side letters in this agreement?
Yeah, side letters or just action, like as I said, appoint expert panelists, or lots of things. Of course, we are open to talk. We respect the concerns. There's nothing wrong with the concerns being raised. It's just that the way to address them is not necessarily by opening an agreement that has been closed and that has lots of things where political forces, certainly in Mexico, will say, well, what about this? What about that? So it's a delicate balance that can be best respected and work together towards addressing the concerns. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's the way I see it.
And another recent issue with discussions about NAFTA has been President Trump, as he was leaving the G20, said he would be withdrawing from the current NAFTA. Yes. And it would be a way of forcing Congress to choose between USMCA or choose between pre-NAFTA. Are you concerned by this? And I mean, what does this mean for this $1.2 trillion relationship?
Well, the president threatening to pull out of the agreement is something for the American political bodies to argue. But I mean, I know that there are many whose view is that it's not so easy to just pull out, because the authority on trade policy rests with Congress. For example, you can pull out of the agreement, but the United States doesn't take up an agreement like the NAFTA or the new one by turning the whole thing into law. That's what you do in Mexico. In Mexico, you take the whole agreement as it is and you adopt it as a law. What kind of law? Very, very high law, just under the Constitution, which means that if there's any conflict between that law and anything else, the treaty with the United States prevails, okay? That's Mexico, so we don't have to prepare implementing legislation. The NAFTA, the USMCA is the law. In the United States, that's not the case. In the United States, you adopt it, implement it through implementing legislation. Legislation comes from Congress. So the president can get out of the NAFTA itself, but what about the implementing legislation that put the NAFTA into place? Some things he can change, the value of tariffs probably, but many things would be very tricky. So I imagine that these are just discussions in a political context, just putting pressure on Congress to do the right thing and approve it, which is what he wants. But getting out of NAFTA is a complicated proposition.
Mm-hmm. And beyond NAFTA, I mean, there's been many concerns surrounding Trump's tariff policies and how he's pursued those. And in the new USMCA, Mexico and Canada were able to get out of any potential auto tariffs in the future. But in the meantime, there's still tariffs on steel and aluminum from the two countries. Where are the conversations on that? I mean, there had been a big expectation that it would be lifted before signing.
Well, it's the unfortunate fact of having a change of government, and I'm not sure where the dialogue is. It's something that we need to resolve quickly, almost immediately. I think it's in the interest of both countries to get it out of the way. It hasn't been done, and if the new Congress comes into office, you are quickly going to have the still things getting intermixed with the ratification. So it's my concern. It's something that I would deal with immediately. It's not been done. We are having discussions in the Mexican government. The approach taken from the beginning, I believe, was wrong from Mexico, which was to impose tariffs on not on steel products, not direct retaliation, but on pork and tomatoes and all kinds of agricultural produce coming from the United States. The explanation given by the previous administration was, well, if this comes from President Trump and his forces, let's respond against their electors. So the pork and the tomatoes and all those were chosen on the basis of electoral profile, where President Trump drew more support from. Maybe that contributed to the Democratic Congress to come into power. I don't know whether it did or not, but it's not a great idea. To me, it's something that comes from the sector. It is steel producers in the two countries canvassing and cajoling their governments to take certain actions. So the right thing is to have trade action going directly in reverse. That hasn't been done. So I'm not sure what will be the near future, but there should be high-level attention. I'm sure that the U.S. government wants this solved, certainly the Mexican government wants it solved, but they just haven't done enough collective thinking in the new administration to get it out of the way.
Okay.
Yeah.
Now we're going to turn it over to the audience. I'm sure that everyone has some NAFTA questions. If you want to raise your hand, and then I think they'll bring a mic over to you. There.
There was.
Yes. They're heading to you.
Great, thank you. Jason Marzek, I direct the Adrian Arch Latin America Center here. First of all, Dr. Seade, thank you so much for coming. I understand this is your first official trip to Washington as Undersecretary for North America of the new government of President Lopez Obrador. So thank you very much for coming to the Atlantic Council for your first official trip to Washington.
Undersecretary designate. So I have to say, Undersecretary is designate because
Undersecretary designate.
There has to be ratification, and that has not been completed.
Thank you. Thank you. I want to, very good question.
If I don't say that, maybe, since it's on the record, maybe some senator will complain tomorrow.
Okay, so let me rephrase. Undersecretary designate Seade.
Yeah.
Let me just take a moment, actually a two-part question. One is ratification in the U.S. Congress. I say it's probable, it's likely, but it's not guaranteed. What are the implications for Mexico and for North America if the new USMCA is not ratified? And then, if you can, just a slightly off-topic question from USMCA, but I think taking advantage of you being here, is how you see President Lopez Obrador's approach to North America changing with regard, in comparison to the previous president. Especially, there were a number of periods of tense relationships between the U.S. administration and the previous administration. The relationship has gotten off to a very good start, especially during the transition. So how do you see that relationship moving forward in these next couple of years?
Yes, thank you. Well, on the first question, my sense, and it's again, I'm speaking to the experts, you are Americans, observing the American political scene. My sense is that since more or less February, March of this year, the attention of the public, in a broad definition of public, enterprises, business sector, big firms, small firms, business associations, governors all over the country, the attention to the value of the NAFTA has increased a lot, and the value of having this new treaty. Opinion polls early in the year said that anything could happen, but increasingly through February, March, May, June onwards, you keep reading of letters from the chief executives of top firms, top car manufacturers or energy firms or others, and then business associations, everybody. The sea level, the tide of public opinion has gone strongly in the direction of support for the deal. So dumping the NAFTA and then not approving the other one seems to me would be not very likely, because lawmakers are sensitive to public opinion, and public opinion seems to have moved in the direction of wanting trade. Now there's this strategic issue by President Trump of threatening to kill NAFTA as a means to almost force lawmakers to approve the other one. That's strategic, and strategy can always go in any direction. But my sense is that if, putting that aside, if the new treaty were not to be approved, I wouldn't see a lot of political capital in also dumping the NAFTA. My expectation is that if USMCA were not to be passed, then there's NAFTA. And then the two governments would probably resume negotiations to have something smaller, the less contentious areas. There's a lot that was achieved. A lot of the benefit of the negotiation was updating and improving, not only updating, improving ambiguities and things of that kind. There was a massive amount of improvement of what had already been negotiated in the NAFTA, and that can be done probably in a pretty non-contentious issue and some other things. But my expectation is that if the new treaty doesn't pass, the NAFTA will be more resilient, more difficult to kill. Your second question was to López Obrador. Well, López Obrador was very keen to see this over, done, partly because he supports it. I mean, we want to have a good trade and investment basis to have a good relationship, but mainly because he wants very much to turn the page and move to bigger things. I mean, the way he puts it is that for ages, for many presidential periods in both countries, we have had pretty much a common catalog of major political problems, each of which is seen as Mexico's problem in Mexico and America's problem in America. On security, on migration. Both countries have a terrible problem in migration, different problems, but it is all migration. And now López Obrador is very much projecting the concept that these are not separate problems with the same name, they are two sides of the same coin. And so we have to work together. And he seems to have made quite a bit of effect on President Trump. President Trump has been extremely courteous and welcoming and instructing his officers to talk about these issues in a constructive way. So I really see things moving nicely in the direction of trying to find out what can we do to deal more seriously than ever before with major common problems on migration, on security, on drugs and violence, on money laundering, all kinds of things that are really hurting America inside and hurting Mexico inside. And in fact, it's the same problem.
Right there?
There's somebody there. Also here. I admire the composure of previous speakers that could perform nicely with those lights in front. But looking this way is easier, but looking that way is much more difficult.
Well, you're doing a great job in the spotlight. My name is Paula Stern, and I'd like to ask you what you believe in the fight in Congress that's going to be coming up will be the role of the energy industry in the domestic U.S. political debate. Most people don't appreciate, as I'm sure you do understand, that energy has played no role in past trade agreements because it was never covered in trade agreements. But this is an extraordinary time for and potential for the energy industry to play the kind of role that, for example, steel that you mentioned or automobiles, which you dwelled on. Would you reflect on that and tell us a little bit more to the extent to which the energy industry is playing a role?
Well, is playing a role, is again going into US politics, and I have not really started. I'm not saying that I will not try to help and to get into that, but we started in our new jobs less than 2 weeks ago, and this is my first visit to the US, and it'll be a visit for 1 day without any night, from the morning to the evening that I fly out. So I haven't had a chance to really get into what role the energy industry is playing in these debates. But I'm positive they will be super supportive because the previous agreement, which is the NAFTA, has a completely closed energy sector, okay? Now there's been a change in the constitution in Mexico, change in the law. President López Obrador has said loud and clear that he's not going to turn that back and he's not going to go into reverse, but he can change his mind. If you're an energy CEO, you say, well, what is my guarantee? My guarantee is the USMCA, because in the USMCA, we do have a very robust, powerful energy sector that is giving the United States the same as Canada is already getting through the TPP-11. So Canada has it, many countries have it, and we have no intention of putting that into reverse. But unless the United States, in dumping the USMCA, decides to join the TPP that you left, there's no protection for the energy industry in the international treaty. Of course, we have the law and all that, and of course, they have contracts, so they have plenty of protection. But it's always very valuable to have an international agreement, an international treaty, as it is for us, on your side. There are people who say that the NAFTA has legal provisions that make the legal opening, the constitutional change and all that, part of the NAFTA, a so-called ratchet clause. But it's far from clear. It's far from clear. That's not really to be relied on for legal purposes. So I do believe that the energy industry is one of the sectors that is a clear winner in terms of legal certitude. I expect them to be fighting for it. I'm sorry to be coughing with this here.
Miguel Loyola from Mackenzie. I was very intrigued by your statement that there's a paradigm shift from a trade relationship to a joint investment mindset among the three countries.
At the margin, I have to say, it's not a sea change, but the direction, yeah.
Right, at least that mindset or that direction is quite interesting. And in that sense, I'm maybe picking up on the question from Paula, but broadly, what areas would you like investment in Mexico? Infrastructure, the train, the railroads, energy, so that we can begin to get a sense of where we should be focusing on transmitting this message.
Well, thank you for giving me the opportunity of talking about new priorities other than the trade treaty. What the treaty itself, I think, provides is for this movement that I use the auto industry as an example to say that trade is a bit kind of made more difficult and investment is the name of the game. The same applies pretty much across manufacturers. All manufacturers, the rules of origin in trade terms, so basically the rules that tell you what goods can flow freely, tax-free within North America, the rules of origin in all manufacturing sectors become tougher. So it becomes more difficult to use components, parts, coming from outside, even engineering, and you have to do more inside North America. So the point I was making about the car industry applies to chemical products or to electro-domestic products or to steel itself, apart from the fact that steel has this 232 tariff still in place, so it's an area of great tension. But in terms of the treaty, the treatment of steel in the treaty is probably the most favored sector, because not only the rules of origin increase, so production has to be inside, but also, for example, in the car industry, there's a condition that didn't exist before, that 70% of the steel used in the car industry has to be from North America. So, all manufacturing sectors have the same kind of situation that I mentioned. That's not the same as what are the priorities for the López Obrador government. Of course, we want investment in all of those and the next. But the areas where he wants to really put the accent are related to the big problem that I was mentioning, migration. He wants to stop migration, not by hammering people with a baseball bat. He's a great baseball fan. On the head because they want to migrate, but by creating conditions that invite them not to migrate, because there is movement, there is activity, there is employment. So he's really putting together a big investment plan in the poor areas of Mexico, and also agreements to benefit the three Central American countries right at the north, so-called Northern Triangle of Central American countries. So he's been putting in place, and that's very much my central job now, not the NAFTA, not the USMCA, is to work with many other people in different ministries towards a big plan on what I call investment, regional development, and migration. So that's infrastructure projects, and that's also regional development projects, so small roads going into the areas where poor peasants are located to facilitate their incorporation to trade and all that. So infrastructure of different kinds is. We have the big project of the Trans-Isthmic, where New Mexico gets narrow. Train. I always thought, well, is it going to compete? Is it going to be able to compete with the Panama Canal? Which is the idea? Well, maybe if you create highly efficient technology, it saves about 1,000 miles each way to go from China to the east coast of the United States. So it's way north of the Panama Canal. But recently that I began to work on this, I discovered, I didn't know, I'm sure it's well known to all of you, the Panama Canal is backed up by the Panama train. There's a train line that moves 700,000 containers from one ocean to the other one, so next to the canal. So depending on the kind of shipping and the route of the shipping and so on, it's often more convenient, more economic to use the train that crosses Panama. Well, the train we're building is over 1,000 miles closer to China and to the United States, so closer to the north, where the big trade is. And that train is carrying 700,000 containers. And to break even this project, the train, we need 300,000. So it's a perfectly feasible project. So that's where the accent is, infrastructure and rural development.
We have time for one last question.
Yes, Jose Diaz with Reforma newspaper from Mexico. Two quick questions. One, specifically, Leader Pelosi has asked Mexico to pass this labor reform as quickly as possible for ratification of the new NAFTA. When can you expect this to pass in the Mexican Congress? And second, how much money is President López Obrador asking the Trump administration to invest in southern Mexico and Central America to prevent migration?
On the second question, it's not clear how much money we are asking. We are starting the dialogue, only starting, and I think there's a good reception. The ticket for the big projects that we are developing is quite hefty. probably 30, 40 billion US dollars. Now, it could come from a big kind of understanding between the two countries and Canada and some kind of a Marshall Plan for the region, as some people have said, or it can come from a more modest contribution from that source, and then also private sector investments, and then also investment from other sources. The British are very interested, the Chinese are very interested on particular things. The main thing will be with the United States, and the figures being tossed are 20, 30 billion. But sorry, the other question was? Huh?
The labor reform in Mexico.
Oh, the labor reform. Yeah. You see, the labor reform is a very interesting area. Come from the constitutional changes passed 2 years ago by the previous administration because they wanted to join TPP. And so in TPP, this was forced. So we had constitutional reforms to protect labor and all that. Now, all that turned out to be completely in line with the priorities of the new government. So when we began to be part of the negotiation, we pushed for those texts, the labor chapter and the labor annex on trade unions, to be more ambitious. And we suggested that all this would be done by the time of the signature. That was the initial agreement. We wanted it to be part of that so as to force ourselves to move forward on labor. Now, then some people began to realize that it was difficult for that to be done by the end of the previous administration because it is the administration that has to send the bill to Congress, and we will not still be in power, although the Congress was already, the new Congress has been in power for a couple of months earlier. So as to solve that, we added a month, and it's end of December. It was a self-inflicted, kind of volunteered timeline so as to force ourselves. You know that President López Obrador, you know it better than anybody here, is in a hurry. He's really a super active man, doing lots of things every minute of the day. And so we want this to be done now, in real time. And the date was chosen that way on the basis that I just told you. Initially, it was intended to be by signature, and then we added a month, so it was the López Obrador government giving it to the Congress, rather than the Peña Nieto having to do it in a very artificial way.
Well, I'd like to thank you so much for being here. I look forward to seeing you more in Washington as you enter your new role. Thank you, everyone, for listening in.
Thank you. Thank you very much.